Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, the Three Topics Gamer, and I have a pretty awesome PlayStation-focused video to share with you guys today. Now, at the time of this video's recording, we are about less than a month away from the release of the PlayStation 5, and I figured how cool would it be if I actually went over all of the current PlayStation platforms that have been released and just go over what I would consider to be my all-time favorite game on each and every single generation. And as you can see from this beautiful collection right here, I got them all. I got PlayStations 1, 2, PSP, PlayStation 3, PlayStation Vita, and the most recent PlayStation 4. Now, I'm sure some people in the comments might ask, whoa, where's the PSP go? And all I can say is, we don't really like to talk about that here in the PlayStation community. So, without wasting any more time, if you happen to enjoy this video by the end, please, I would really appreciate it if you give this video a thumbs up and press the subscribe button if you happen to enjoy content like this and would like to see more from me. And, like always, let's start off with the very first generation, going off with PlayStation 1, or PlayStation X. The first PlayStation. Let's start there. Starting off with the first PlayStation, my favorite game on this system has to go to Final Fantasy VII. Now, I've said this since the very beginning of my channel 8 years ago, but Final Fantasy VII is without question the single most important video game that I've ever played. It's because of this very game that helped determine the type of gamer that I've become to this day. Sure, I may have enjoyed playing the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, and the Game Boy as a kid, but Final Fantasy VII was what really got me into gaming. It's the reason why JRPGs have remained my favorite genre of gaming to this day. It's the reason why I'm a story-driven gamer. And when you look at its historical significance of what Final Fantasy VII did for the genre, one cannot deny its importance to the world of gaming. And when you just examine the game on its own, it's just an incredible game that still holds up to me. The gameplay is solid, the story is incredible, and even though the overall look of this game is clearly outdated by a couple of decades, I would pick this version of the game over that sad excuse of a so-called remake that came out in 2020. But ultimately what gives Final Fantasy VII its spot as my favorite PlayStation 1 game of all time is not just the fact that it influenced me so much as a gamer, but as a person. Without this game, none of the other games on this list would even be here. I probably wouldn't even be a gamer and this channel wouldn't even exist. I practically owe everything to this game, which is why it will always remain my favorite PlayStation 1 game of all time. Going on into PlayStation 2, I have Metal Gear Solid 3, which is not only my favorite entry in the Metal Gear Solid franchise, but it has remained my favorite video game of all time. Now, I could easily make an hour-long video going over why this game is so important to me, but to keep things simple, this game came out in 2003, and I have yet to play any game since then that I would even say comes close to rivaling it. Even on the short list of games that I would give 10 out of 10s to, this game rises above all of them. Metal Gear Solid 3 really is a great example as for why Hideo Kojima is to this day regarded as a genius in my eyes. He is for video games what Christopher Nolan is for films to me. The Metal Gear series really has one of the most unique ways of telling its story while incorporating real-world historical events and issues into its storyline, and this is made even better with an incredible cast of characters. Big Boss in Metal Gear Solid 3 is a serious contender for the title of my all-time favorite video game character, if not for a certain legendary guardian from Spira. And seeing everything that he has to go through as a character really grants him a lot of depth, and in terms of how he views everything from the beginning and how everything plays out in the end, and how a singular moment can bring up so many topic ideas that continue to echo out through the entire franchise. The gameplay, even for 2003 standards, really works and still holds up to this day, at least for me. And this is coming from someone who, at the time when I first played this game, wasn't really into stealth games, but this game did teach me the importance of patience, and through this game's incredible storyline, it helped me learn a number of serious life lessons that I still follow to this day. And I know that for many that may sound silly coming from a person saying that this game could give you any kind of ideas that would be of any importance, but that is very much what this video game did. And much like Final Fantasy VII did, it played a serious part in shaping me as a person, which is why Metal Gear Solid 3 will always remain my favorite PlayStation 2 game of all time, as well as my favorite video game of all time. Going into my personal favorite generation of PlayStation, that being the PlayStation 3 era, my favorite game for this console has to go to Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. And the funny thing about this game was that it was actually a game that I picked up several months before getting my very first PlayStation 3 when I went to college back in '08. Metal Gear Solid 4 had a very difficult task in not only bringing an end to a franchise that began all the way back in 1987, but a storyline that spans over 60 years. Now, it's no secret that Metal Gear probably has one of the most confusing storylines to follow, so much so that even Hideo Kojima himself gets confused sometimes. But I believe that he and the development team at Kojima Productions did an incredible job with this game. The gameplay style this time around was at its best that it had ever been, with the inclusion of so many unique tools and weapons that really gives you so many choices of how you can play through the game. The visuals, even to this day for me, are very impressive, and this game also includes my all-time favorite moment out of all of the Metal Gear Solid games. This game as a whole is somewhat really projective of the difficulties that were faced by the PlayStation 3 era. It may be true that it starts off kind of rough, and it certainly stumbles along the way, but by the end, everything works out perfectly, and not many franchises have such a run that can manage to be as satisfying as this one, but this game managed to pull it off, which is why this game will remain my favorite PlayStation 3 game of all time. Moving on to the PlayStation Portable, my favorite game on this handheld has to go to one of the greatest prequels of all time, and that is Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. Looking back on this handheld now, this device must have been really difficult to develop for, and because of its design, it was very limiting. But there were a number of titles that managed to do more with less and create some really incredible games, and this one was my favorite above all others. Crisis Core takes place right before the events of Final Fantasy VII and follows the life story of Zack Fair and the events that would lead up to the main game. Now, Zack was a character that you learned very little about in the original game, and this entry did an incredible job of showing just how important Zack was to the overall story. The gameplay was very action-focused, and despite the PSP's design's limitation, Square Enix managed to make it work. It even has some really great cinematics and some of the most impressive cinematics you will see throughout the entire franchise. The main reason I find myself drawn to this game in particular is because of how little respect it gets nowadays. The so-called Final Fantasy VII Remake completely spits all over this game, and a good portion of the fan base either doesn't know about this game's existence or has completely forgotten about it. This game was a true gem for the handheld and did its job incredibly well, showing the amount of potential that it had, and that's something I never forgot, thanks to this game in particular, which is why every time I think of the PSP, I immediately think of this game. Going on to the PlayStation 4 era, my favorite game that came out for this generation was actually released here in the States in 2020, and that was Persona 5 Royal. Now, back in 2016, when I first saw this game at PlayStation Experience 2016, I had never even heard of the Persona franchise. But after finishing the original game, it easily became not only a top 5 favorite JRPG of all time, but it became a top 3 favorite PlayStation 4 exclusive. And if the Royal Edition had never been released, then this game would have certainly have lost the number 1 spot to God of War 4. But what the Royal Edition did this year would be the equivalent of watching the theatrical cut of Lord of the Rings Fellowship of the Rings, then watching the extended cut, and then never wanting to watch the theatrical cut again. The Royal Edition came out about 3 years here in the States to the original 2017 release here in the States, and it had so many improvements and additions that made an already incredible game even better, and that's something I've never seen happen to any other game that I've played in such a short amount of time. The story was incredible, the characters were fascinating, the gameplay used a traditional style of turn-based combat, and not to go for a more fast-paced style like most JRPGs do these days, and that made the game stand apart. And the soundtrack, oh my god, the soundtrack blew all my expectations away. This game easily has a top 5 favorite video game soundtrack of all time for me, and when you think about the fact that since I first played Final Fantasy VII in 1997, back on the original PlayStation, out of all of the countless JRPG games that I have played since then, there's only one game in existence that I would pick over Persona 5 Royal, making it only my second favorite JRPG of all time. And that is one hell of an accomplishment for this game to have pulled off in such a short amount of time, which is why it ended up being my favorite PlayStation 4 game of all time. Finally, we have the PlayStation Vita, and my favorite game on this handheld has to go to Persona 4 Golden. Now, to be blunt, the only reason why this is the case is because I played Persona 5. Once I'd finished playing the original Persona 5 game, I immediately wanted to start playing the other entries, and the first one on that list just so happens to be this game. Now, to be fair, while the PlayStation Vita was a better handheld in design than the PSP, it certainly was lacking in terms of quality of games, and not many games that were attached to mainstream franchises ever made a game for this handheld. Most of the games that came out on the Vita felt more like indie games, and because of that, it made this game in particular really stand out. If I hadn't played this game, then my favorite game on this handheld probably would have been Uncharted Golden Abyss, but that game, to be fair, was kind of forgettable anyway. Having never played the original Persona 4 back on the PlayStation 2, the Golden Edition on PlayStation Vita does look and play like a lesser version of Persona 5, which makes sense. There are a lot of similarities between Persona 4 and Persona 5, and though this game did come out first, Persona 5 did it way better. But that's no strike against this game because it's still very enjoyable and is really one of the only primary reasons that I would even recommend someone go out of the way to get a PS Vita to play this game, which is why it will always remain my favorite. And that concludes my list of my all-time favorite games on each and every single PlayStation platform that has been released up to this point. And I think that is an incredible lineup, in my opinion, that I've enjoyed all of these games over all of these current platforms. So now that you guys know what games I enjoy the most on each and every single one of these platforms, I would love to know from all of these platforms that you may have played or owned, what was your all-time favorite game on each and every single one of them? Share your list with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, thank you guys for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you next time.